I'm Addison, 22 years old and drowning in nearly $100,000 of student debt. Every Thanksgiving, we gather at my billionaire grandfather Lawrence Harrington's mansion, a tradition I usually enjoy despite the financial anxiety gnawing at me. This year, between turkey slices and cranberry sauce, Grandpa casually mentioned my college fund. I blinked. What fund? Dad choked on his drink. Mom went pale, and my younger cousin Thomas whispered, "Wait, you didn't know?" Before continuing this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever discovered a family secret that changed everything. My life before that fateful Thanksgiving dinner was what most would call a typical struggling college student experience. I'm a senior majoring in finance at State University, ironically learning about money management while barely staying afloat financially myself. The bitter irony never escaped me studying how wealth works while having none of my own. My apartment is what real estate agents might generously call cozy. In reality, it's a 300-square-foot studio with a bathroom so small I brush my teeth while showering to save time. The walls are thin enough that I know my neighbor Gary's taste in music better than my own. The rent eats half my monthly income, but it's the cheapest place within walking distance to campus, saving me from car expenses I couldn't possibly afford. To make ends meet, I juggle 3 jobs. Mornings at the campus coffee shop start at 5 a.m., where I serve lattes to professors who sometimes teach my afternoon classes. Evenings and weekends, I deliver food for 2 different apps simultaneously, maximizing efficiency by taking orders going in the same direction. Between shifts, I squeeze in classes and homework, often surviving on less than 5 hours of sleep. My diet consists mainly of ramen, rice, and whatever food the coffee shop would otherwise throw away. Protein is a luxury I splurge on once a week. I've become an expert at calculating cost per calorie, stretching every dollar until it screams. The student loan statements arrive monthly, like clockwork, the numbers growing with interest despite my payments. $98,732 at last count. The figure haunts my dreams. I've calculated that even with aggressive payments, I'll be in my 40s before I'm free of this debt. My relationship with my parents, Michael and Sandra, has always been strained when it comes to finances. They live in a spacious 5-bedroom house in an upscale suburb, drive luxury vehicles, and take European vacations twice yearly. Yet whenever college expenses came up, the response was always the same. "We just don't have it, Addison. We've got our own bills to pay." I never questioned this growing up. They made good money, Dad, as a regional manager for a retail chain, Mom running her interior design business, but I assumed they had expenses I didn't understand. "College is your responsibility," they told me when I was 16. "It builds character to work for your education." Meanwhile, they surprised each other with expensive anniversary gifts and renovated their master bathroom for $40,000. My grandfather Lawrence is something of a legend in our family and in the business world. He built a technology manufacturing company from scratch in the 80s, perfectly positioned for the tech boom that followed. By the time I was born, he was already worth hundreds of millions. Now in his 70s, he's officially a billionaire, though you'd never know it from his modest demeanor. I've always admired him, though our interactions were limited to holidays and the occasional family gathering. He worked constantly, even after supposedly retiring 5 years ago. When we did talk, he asked thoughtful questions about my studies and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. "Finance is the language of opportunity," he once told me. "Master it, and you'll never be without options." I took his words to heart, choosing my major with his wisdom in mind. The week before Thanksgiving, I was more stressed than usual. Finals were approaching. My bank account was nearly empty despite my constant working, and I'd just received notice that my student loan interest rates were increasing. The thought of spending the holiday surrounded by wealthy relatives discussing their investment portfolios and vacation homes filled me with dread. I couldn't afford a proper outfit for dinner, so I ironed my one decent button-down shirt and slacks, hoping no one would notice I'd worn the same thing last year. I emptied my change jar to put enough gas in my 15-year-old Honda to make the 2-hour drive to my grandfather's estate. On the drive there, I rehearsed answers to inevitable questions about my plans after graduation. The truth that I had no idea how I'd balance entry-level income with massive loan payments seemed too depressing for holiday conversation. I practiced a confident smile in the rearview mirror, determined not to let my financial anxiety ruin the holiday for everyone else. I also thought about what I was thankful for, trying to cultivate genuine gratitude despite my circumstances. I was getting a good education after all. I had my health. I had family who, despite not helping financially, did seem to care about me in their own way. Still, as I approached the massive iron gates of my grandfather's estate, I couldn't help feeling the stark contrast between my life and theirs, wondering why the path had been so much harder for me. Grandfather's estate sprawled across 30 acres of perfectly maintained grounds. The main house, calling it a mansion feels inadequate, stood 3 stories tall, with limestone facades and more windows than I could count. A circular driveway wrapped around an ornate fountain where water danced in choreographed patterns, the late autumn sunlight catching each droplet. I parked my rusting Honda between Dad's Mercedes and Uncle Jake's Range Rover, the contrast almost comical. The car shuddered as I turned off the engine, as if exhausted from the journey. Taking a deep breath, I checked my appearance one last time in the mirror, patted my jacket pocket to make sure the small hostess gift for grandmother was still there, and stepped out into the crisp November air. The butler, an actual butler named Simmons who'd worked for grandfather since before I was born, greeted me at the door with a warm smile that made me feel slightly less out of place. "Master Addison, how wonderful to see you again. The family is gathering in the East Sitting Room, because one sitting room isn't enough when you have 20,000 square feet of living space." I followed the familiar path through hallways adorned with original artwork and antiques, worth more than everything I'd ever owned combined. The room buzzed with conversation when I entered. Grandfather's home hosted the extended family for Thanksgiving: aunts, uncles, cousins, and a few family friends who'd become honorary Harringtons over the years. Uncle Jake and Aunt Patricia held court near the fireplace. Their son Thomas slouched in an armchair nearby, eyes glued to his phone. At 16, Thomas had already been gifted a sports car for his birthday, attended a Swiss boarding school, and had a trust fund waiting for him. Addison, Aunt Amanda, Dad's younger sister, waved me over. Unlike my father, Amanda had followed grandfather into the business, serving as the company's chief marketing officer. Her husband William worked there too, heading the legal department. They represented the company branch of the family, while my father had always kept his distance from the business. "How's school?" Amanda asked, handing me a glass of sparkling water. "Still on track to graduate this spring?" "If I pass econometrics." "Yes," I replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "You'll do fine," she assured me. "You've got the Harrington head for numbers." She lowered her voice. "And how are things otherwise? You look tired." Before I could answer, my cousin Thomas appeared at my elbow. "Hey, college man," he said, somehow making it sound like an insult. "Dad says you're working 3 jobs. Why don't you just ask Grandpa for an internship at the company? Pays better than delivering tacos." "Some of us like earning our own way," I replied, instantly regretting the defensive tone. Thomas hadn't done anything wrong, really. He just happened to be born into different circumstances. "Sure, whatever," Thomas shrugged. "Just saying, family takes care of family. That's what Grandpa always says." I spotted my grandmother Eleanor across the room, elegant as always in a simple but obviously expensive dress, her silver hair styled perfectly. Unlike many of the family members who measured worth in dollars, grandmother had always emphasized character. She caught my eye and beckoned me over, saving me from further conversation with Thomas. "My dear boy," she said, kissing my cheek. "How wonderful to see you. Tell me everything about your classes." Grandmother was the only one who regularly called to check on me throughout the year, sending care packages during finals and remembering details about my professors and friends. She listened now with genuine interest as I described my course load and part-time jobs. "You're working too hard," she said finally, patting my hand. "Your grandfather and I are concerned." "I'm fine, Grandmother," I assured her. "Builds character, right?" Something flashed across her face. Confusion? Concern? But before she could respond, Simmons announced dinner was served. The dining room could comfortably seat 30, though today we were just 15 people scattered along a table that stretched beneath 3 crystal chandeliers. Fine china, sterling silver, and crystal glassware adorned the table, each place setting probably worth a month of my rent. I found my name card between my mother and Uncle William. Across from me sat Thomas and his parents. Grandfather and grandmother took the heads of the table, as always. Conversation flowed around typical wealthy family topics as the first course was served. Uncle Jake described their recent trip to the Maldives. Aunt Patricia complained about renovation delays on their vacation home in Aspen. My mother talked about redecorating their home office for the 3rd time in 5 years. "We're thinking of taking a Mediterranean cruise this spring," my father announced. Sandra found a lovely 16-day itinerary with all the best ports. I focused on my soup, calculating how many hours of minimum wage work it would take to pay for a single day on such a cruise. "About 80, I estimated. "What about you, Addison?" Uncle William asked, perhaps noticing my silence. "Any big plans after graduation?" "Finding a job that pays enough to cover student loans while still affording food would be nice," I said, attempting humor to mask the truth. A few uncomfortable chuckles circled the table. My mother shot me a warning look. We didn't discuss financial struggles in this family, at least not real ones. Lamenting the price of a new boat was acceptable. Worrying about basic necessities was not. "Speaking of your education," Grandfather said from the head of the table, his voice instantly commanding everyone's attention, "I've been meaning to ask, how are you enjoying the college fund we set up for you? I hope it's allowed you to focus more on your studies than on work." The table went silent. I stared at him, confused. "What fund?" I asked. The silence following my question had a physical weight to it. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Dad had been taking a sip of his expensive red wine. Now he was coughing violently, the liquid having gone down the wrong way. Mom's face, normally animated and carefully made up, had gone completely pale. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Grandfather Lawrence furrowed his brow, looking genuinely confused. "The trust fund," he clarified, as though I might have misheard. "The one Eleanor and I established when you were 5. It should have more than covered your university expenses." I felt the room spin slightly. "Grandfather, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never had access to any trust fund. I have nearly $100,000 in student loans." A muffled gasp came from Grandmother Eleanor. Grandfather's confusion morphed slowly into something darker, the expression of a man who built an empire discovering something amiss in his kingdom. Then, from beside me, my cousin Thomas whispered, "Wait, you didn't know?" His voice was quiet, but in the silence, everyone heard it. "Dad manages my fund, but yours was supposed to go directly to you when you started college. That's what I heard them talking about last Christmas." My parents' reactions told the story before any words were spoken. Dad was now staring fixedly at his plate, wine forgotten. Mom's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass, nearly knocking it over. "Michael," Grandfather addressed my father, using his full name, never a good sign. "Would you care to explain?" Dad cleared his throat. "Dad, perhaps this isn't the right time or place." "I disagree," Grandfather interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "I think Thanksgiving, when we express gratitude for our blessings, is precisely the right time to discuss why my grandson is unaware of the significant financial blessing intended for him." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cousins, aunts, and uncles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between the main players in this unfolding drama. "We can discuss this privately after dinner," my mother interjected, attempting to salvage the situation with a strained smile. "Sandra," Grandmother Eleanor spoke now, her voice gentle but firm. "If what Addison says is true, and he has been taking on debt while a fund existed to prevent exactly that, I think we need to address it immediately." I looked at my father, silently pleading for an explanation that would make sense of this bizarre situation. "Dad, what's going on?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he attempted to redirect. "Lawrence, you know how complicated these financial instruments can be. There were investment decisions, market downturns." "Stop." Grandfather's command was quiet but absolute. The trust was straightforward and conservatively invested. Even in the worst market, it should have contained at least $500,000 by the time Addison reached college age. $500,000. The figure hit me like a physical blow. With that kind of money, I could have completed my degree without a single loan, without working myself to exhaustion, without the constant stress and anxiety about my future. Addison, grandfather turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Would you join me in my study after dinner? I believe we need to review some documents. I nodded, still too shocked to form coherent sentences. The remainder of the meal passed in awkward fragments of conversation as various relatives attempted to dispel the tension. The food, despite being expertly prepared, tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Uncle Jake kept shooting suspicious glances at my father. Aunt Amanda whispered intensely to Uncle William, likely discussing legal implications. Thomas looked almost guilty, as though he regretted being the one to confirm my ignorance. When dinner finally concluded, grandfather stood. Addison, if you'll come with me, Michael and Sandra, you as well. I followed him through the house to his wood-paneled study, my parents trailing behind like reluctant schoolchildren. Grandmother Eleanor joined us without invitation, her normally serene face lined with worry. Grandfather went directly to a large safe concealed behind a painting, how stereotypically wealthy, and removed several folders. I keep copies of all important family documents here, he explained, spreading papers across his massive desk. Here, he pointed to a legal document, the Addison Harrington Educational Trust, established January 15, 2006, with an initial deposit of $200,000 and subsequent annual contributions. I stared at the paper, seeing my name, seeing the figures, trying to process what this meant. I never knew about this, I said quietly. The funds were to be managed by my financial team until you turned 18, grandfather continued. At that point, the trustees, your parents, were to inform you of its existence. Annual disbursements for educational expenses would begin with college enrollment. I turned to my parents. Is this true? Mom looked away. Dad shifted uncomfortably. We were going to tell you, but what? I demanded, anger beginning to replace shock. But you decided to let me work 60-hour weeks while taking full course loads instead? Let me go into massive debt? Why? Your grandfather has always favored Jake in business. My father suddenly burst out, his voice bitter. He got startup capital, connections, opportunities I never received. When the trust was established, we felt it was finally our turn to benefit from the family wealth. You stole from your own son? Grandmother's voice was barely a whisper. We didn't steal, my mother protested. The trust named us as trustees. We made decisions we felt were appropriate. For yourselves, grandfather's voice was ice, not for Addison. Where did the money go? I asked, dreading the answer. Dad at least had the decency to look ashamed. Home renovations, investments, travel, Sandra's business expansion. The Mediterranean cruises, I said flatly. The new cars every 2 years. The vacation property in Florida. Each revelation was another blow, memories rearranging themselves to show the truth behind the facade. We raised you, my mother said defensively. We gave you everything, except the one thing that was actually mine, I replied, my voice breaking. Grandfather asked my parents to wait outside while he, grandmother, and I continued our conversation. When the door closed behind them, he sank heavily into his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. I failed you, Addison, he said simply. I should have put better safeguards in place. You couldn't have known, I replied, still processing everything. I should have. He opened another folder. I have the bank records here. The distributions to your parents' account began right on schedule when you started college. $50,000 per year, for 4 years. Plus additional funds for living expenses, books, everything you might need. He pushed a stack of statements toward me. Each one showed transfers from Addison Harrington Educational Trust to an account I didn't recognize. My parents' account. $200,000 total for your education, grandmother said softly, plus approximately $50,000 more for related expenses. Meanwhile, I've been eating ramen and working myself sick, I said, a hollow laugh escaping me. all while they watched me struggle. "There's more," grandfather continued, his expression grave. "The principal balance of the trust should still be intact, over $300,000, based on our investment strategy and market performance. $300,000. My future, my freedom from debt, my chance to start adult life on solid footing. Can we recover it?" I asked. "Legally, yes," grandfather nodded. "The trust was explicitly for your education and future establishment. Any withdrawals not used for those purposes represent a breach of fiduciary duty. William can begin proceedings immediately." "You'd sue your own son?" grandmother asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "If necessary," grandfather replied, "though I'd prefer Michael and Sandra make this right voluntarily." A knock at the door interrupted us. Without waiting for a response, my father entered, mother close behind. Their earlier defensiveness seemed to have hardened into righteous indignation. "You had no right to exclude us from this discussion," Dad began. "I had every right," grandfather replied calmly. "As the creator of the trust and Addison's grandfather. Now, shall we discuss how you plan to make restitution?" "Restitution?" Mom scoffed. "For what? For raising our son? For providing him a home, food, clothing, for 18 years? That's called being a parent," I said, finding my voice. "It's what you signed up for when you had me. The trust wasn't payment for doing the bare minimum." "Bare minimum?" Dad's face flushed red. "We gave you everything. Private school, summer camps, braces, all things other parents provide without stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from their children," I interrupted. "And when it came time for college, something you knew was coming for years, you suddenly claimed you couldn't help, while actively taking the money earmarked for exactly that purpose." "We deserved it," Mom said, her voice frighteningly sincere. "Your father worked for Lawrence's company for years without the recognition Jake received. When Jake got capital to start his division, what did Michael get? Nothing. I left the company, Sandra," Dad corrected her. "That was my choice." "Because you were always overlooked," she insisted. "And then Jake gets handed everything on a silver platter while we struggled." "You haven't struggled a day in your lives," I said incredulously. "You live in a 5,000 square foot house. You drive luxury cars. You take multiple international vacations every year. To maintain our standing in the community," Mom explained, as if to a child, "to preserve the Harrington name. While your son works 3 jobs and goes into debt." Grandfather's voice was quiet but devastating. "Is that also preserving the Harrington name?" For the first time, something like genuine shame crossed my father's face. "We may have miscalculated." "Miscalculated?" I repeated, disbelief coloring every syllable. "You stole my future and call it a miscalculation?" "We plan to help you after graduation," Dad offered weakly. "Once you had a job, we would have assisted with the loan payments." "With my own money," I clarified. "How generous." Grandmother, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Michael, Sandra, I've known you both for decades. I attended your wedding. I held Addison the day he was born. I need to understand how you justified this to yourselves." My mother's composure finally cracked. "It started small," she admitted. "College was years away. We needed capital for the house renovation. We borrowed from the trust, intending to pay it back. But then there were other expenses," Dad continued. "Sandra's business expansion, market opportunities. It snowballed. And when I actually started college, I pressed." A long pause. "We were overextended," Dad finally said. "Underwater on the house, credit card debt. Using the trust disbursements was the only way to maintain our lifestyle, while watching your son work himself to exhaustion," grandfather concluded, "taking on debt that would follow him for decades. The full weight of their betrayal crashed over me. Not just the money, though, that was substantial, but the callousness, the willingness to watch me suffer daily while living off what was rightfully mine." "Get out," I said quietly. Addison Mom began. "Get out of this room," I clarified. "I can't look at either of you right now." They hesitated, looking to grandfather as if for support. Finding none, they quietly left the study. As the door closed, the strength that had carried me through the confrontation evaporated. I collapsed into a chair, hands shaking. What happens now? I asked no one in particular. Grandfather placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Now, we fix what can be fixed. Word spread quickly through the house. By the time we emerged from grandfather's study, the entire family knew something monumental had occurred. Uncle Jake paced the hallway outside, while Aunt Amanda spoke in hushed tones with Uncle William, likely discussing legal ramifications. Dinner had been cleared, but no one had moved to the living room for dessert as tradition dictated. Instead, family members clustered in tense groups, conversations pausing as we entered. My parents sat isolated on a love seat, the physical distance between them and everyone else, a visual representation of their new status in the family hierarchy. Lawrence, Uncle Jake approached immediately. Is it true? Did they take Addison's trust fund? They misappropriated funds intended for his education, Grandfather confirmed, his tone measured. We're determining the exact amount and discussing restitution options. Restitution? Dad stood, color high in his cheeks. You make it sound like we committed a crime. Breach of fiduciary duty is a crime, Michael, Uncle William said quietly. As the family attorney, I feel obligated to point that out. You're seriously considering legal action? Mom looked horrified. Against family? You didn't seem concerned about family when you were spending Addison's money, Aunt Patricia remarked, her normally placid face tight with disapproval. The conversation devolved quickly, voices rising as family members took sides. Most supported me, expressing outrage at my parents' actions, but a few suggested the situation wasn't that simple or that family matters should remain private. Private? I finally exploded, silencing the room. I've been working 3 jobs while taking full-time classes. I've been skipping meals to make rent. I've been destroying my health because I believed I had no choice. Meanwhile, my own parents watched me suffer while spending hundreds of thousands of dollars that was meant for me. Tell me what's not that simple about that. Addison, you don't understand the pressures Dad began. What pressures? Uncle Jake interrupted. Financial pressures? You make 6 figures, Michael. Your house is worth over $1 million. Easy for you to say, Dad shot back. You've always been Lawrence's favorite. Startup capital for your business division. Connections with all the right clients. I stayed with the company, Uncle Jake countered. I worked 80-hour weeks building my division while you decided corporate life wasn't for you. That was your choice. And Addison's suffering was the consequence of that choice, Grandmother said quietly. A young man who had nothing to do with your grievances against your father or brother. We gave him everything, Mom insisted again. Except the one thing that was actually his, Thomas said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at my 16-year-old cousin. Sorry, but it's messed up. If Dad took my trust fund, I'd be furious. This is different, Thomas, my mother said dismissively. How? Thomas challenged. Addison's fund was for his education. Mine is for mine. What's different? We're his parents, Dad insisted. We had his best interests at heart. Best interests? I laughed bitterly. When I called home sophomore year, having panic attacks about money, working 30 hours a week while taking 18 credits, what did you say? Everyone struggles in college, Addison. It builds character. Was that for my benefit? Mom at least had the grace to look ashamed. Or junior year, I continued, unable to stop now that the floodgates had opened, when I got pneumonia, because I couldn't afford to turn the heat up in my apartment, and was too exhausted to fight off the infection. When I missed 2 weeks of work and almost lost my jobs, what was your response? Can't you borrow from a friend? Meanwhile, you were posting photos from your anniversary trip to Hawaii on social media. We worked hard for what we have, Dad defended. No, you stole what I should have had, I corrected. There's a difference. Uncle Jake stepped forward. Michael has always lived beyond his means, he said, addressing the room. Maxed out credit cards since college. Remortgaged the house twice that I know of. How dare you, Dad began. Am I wrong? Jake challenged. You've been chasing the appearance of wealth your entire adult life, spending whatever it takes to look successful rather than building actual success. That's rich coming from you, Dad sneered. Born with the golden touch. Everything you try succeeds. I failed plenty, Jake shot back. The difference is, I didn't steal from my child to cover my failures. The argument escalated, years of sibling rivalry and resentment bubbling to the surface. What had begun as a confrontation about my trust fund had evolved into a full family meltdown, decades of unspoken tensions suddenly finding voice. Grandmother Eleanor, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing distress, suddenly stood. Enough! Her voice, though not loud, commanded attention through sheer moral authority. This family, she said, tears in her eyes, has been blessed with more material wealth than most could imagine, and this, she gestured to the arguing relatives, is what we've become, using money to keep score, stealing from children, justifying terrible choices with entitlement and excuses. She walked to me, taking my hands in hers. Addison, I am so deeply sorry. We failed you. I failed you by not checking that the trust was being properly administered. It's not your fault, grandmother, I said quietly. Perhaps not directly, she acknowledged, but we created this environment where your parents felt their wants superseded your needs. She turned to my parents, her expression a mixture of sorrow and disappointment. Michael, Sandra, I don't recognize the people you've become. The son I raised would never have done this. My father seemed to physically diminish under her gaze. For the first time, I saw him not as the authoritative parent who had shaped my childhood, but as what he truly was, a deeply insecure man who had sacrificed his integrity on the altar of appearances. I couldn't bear to be in the room any longer. The revelations, the arguments, the raw emotions, it was too much. Without a word, I walked out, ignoring the calls from various family members to stay. Outside, the night air was crisp and clean. I walked the grounds of my grandfather's estate, past the manicured gardens now dormant for winter, past the tennis courts and pool house, eventually finding myself at a small pond where we'd fed ducks as children. I sat on a stone bench, trying to process everything that had happened. The betrayal cut so deep, precisely because it explained so much. Years of financial struggles that had never made sense given my family's apparent wealth. The disconnect between their lifestyle and their claims of being unable to help with my education. Their dismissive attitude toward my financial stress. It all fit together now. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. I stayed outside for hours, missing dessert and the traditional family games that followed. The temperature dropped, but I barely noticed, my mind replaying countless moments from the past 4 years in a new, painful context. The night when I'd been so hungry I'd dug through my apartment dumpster for discarded food, while my parents dined at 5-star restaurants. The times I'd fallen asleep in class because I'd worked overnight shifts, while they complained about poor service at luxury resorts. The student health center visit where I'd been diagnosed with exhaustion and malnutrition, while they renovated their kitchen with high-end appliances I now knew had been purchased with my future. Sleep was impossible that night. I tossed and turned in the guest room, anger and grief taking turns dominating my thoughts. By morning, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. I emerged from my room as dawn broke, having given up on sleep entirely. To my surprise, Grandmother Eleanor was already in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She wore a simple robe, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, looking far more vulnerable than her usual polished self. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. I shook my head, accepting the cup of coffee she poured for me. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunrise through the large windows. "When I was your age," she finally said, "I had nothing. Did you know that?" I shook my head again. Family history tended to focus on grandfather's business success, not what came before. "My parents died when I was 19, she continued. "Car accident. I had a partial scholarship to college but had to drop out to support myself. No family to help, no trust funds, no safety net." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I worked as a secretary at the company your grandfather would eventually buy. That's how we met. I was putting myself through night school, one class at a time." "I didn't know," I said, realizing how little I knew about her life before she became a Harrington. "Lawrence and I agreed when we first became wealthy that our children and grandchildren would have advantages we didn't, but we never intended to remove the need for work ethic, for self-reliance." Her eyes met mine. When we established your trust, it was to ensure you could pursue education without the barriers I faced, not to create dependence. I would have used it exactly that way, I said, the familiar anger flickering. I know. She patted my hand. You're like me in that way. Perhaps that's why this betrayal cuts so deep. You would have honored the intention behind the gift. She sighed deeply. Family relationships are complex, Addison. The resentment your father feels toward Lawrence has roots going back decades. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help you understand it. Understanding doesn't fix anything, I pointed out. No, she agreed, but it might help you decide what to save from the ashes of this situation. We talked for nearly 2 hours as the house slowly awakened around us. She shared stories of the early years, of grandfather's struggle to build his business, of Dad's early promise and later disillusionment, of Uncle Jake's failures before his successes, of family dynamics I'd been too young to perceive. Grandfather joined us eventually, looking grave but resolved. I've been up most of the night reviewing options, he said without preamble. William is prepared to establish a new trust today, one that your parents cannot access. We'll transfer funds directly to clear your student loans immediately. Thank you, I said, the prospect of freedom from debt almost too overwhelming to comprehend. It's not a gift, Addison, he clarified. It's returning what was always yours. The harder question is what happens with your parents. As if summoned by his words, my father appeared in the doorway, mother close behind. They looked as sleepless as I felt, Dad unshaven, Mom without her usual perfect makeup. We need to talk, Dad said simply. Grandfather nodded toward the adjacent sitting room. Once we were all seated, an uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Well, I finally prompted. Dad took a deep breath. We were wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. There's no justification for what we did. The straightforward admission surprised me. I'd expected more deflection, more excuses. We've spent the night talking, Mom continued. Really talking for the first time in years. About our choices, our priorities, how we got here. And? Grandfather pressed. And we want to make it right, Dad said, looking directly at me for the first time since the revelation. All of it. We'll sell the house, liquidate investments, whatever it takes to repay every penny. Why should I believe you? I asked, the hurt still too raw for easy forgiveness. You shouldn't, Mom said simply. We haven't earned your trust. We'll have to prove it through actions. Starting with this, Dad placed a folder on the coffee table, paperwork to transfer our house title to your name. It's worth approximately $1.2 million. More than the trust, but it's a start. I stared at the folder, stunned by the gesture but uncertain how to respond. I don't want your house. We know, Mom said, but we need you to understand we're serious. You can sell it, keep it, whatever you decide. The point is, it's yours now. What would you do? I asked, genuinely curious. Where would you live? We've been living beyond our means for years, Dad admitted. We'll downsize to something we can actually afford. Start fresh. Live honestly for once. There was something different in his demeanor, a weight lifted, despite the circumstances, as if the constant pressure of maintaining appearances had been more burdensome than I'd realized. I need time, I said finally. This doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase what happened. We know, they said in unison. But it's a start, Grandfather added. William has drawn up a formal restitution agreement. Everything in writing, legally binding. I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, who had in many ways loved me, but who had also betrayed me in the most fundamental way. Could we rebuild from this? Should we even try? I'm not cutting you out of my life, I decided aloud. But things will be different. I need boundaries. I need honesty. And I need to see actual change, not just promises. They nodded, understanding the terms. And I want you to get counseling, I added. Both of you. Whatever led to this kind of thinking needs to be addressed. Already scheduled, Dad said quietly. First appointment next week. We talked for another hour, establishing terms, setting boundaries, beginning the long process of rebuilding trust. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a path forward that acknowledged the harm done while creating space for potential healing. By the end of that conversation, I had made several decisions. I would accept grandfather's help in clearing my student loans. I would not take my parents' house, but instead would accept a structured repayment plan. I would finish my degree and then decide my next steps without pressure from anyone. Most importantly, I would no longer allow others to define my worth or my future. The trust fund revelation had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. For the first time, I saw clearly how money had distorted my family's values, creating resentments and justifying terrible choices. I wanted something different for myself. 6 months later, I stood in my graduation cap and gown, diploma in hand, debt-free. The journey from that Thanksgiving revelation to this moment had been challenging but transformative. True to their word, my parents had begun making significant changes. They sold their oversized house, moving to a modest condo. Dad took financial counseling and a position with a nonprofit, a substantial pay cut but work he found meaningful. Mom scaled back her design business to focus on affordable projects for middle-income clients rather than luxury homes. The restitution payments came regularly, deposited into an account managed by Uncle William to ensure transparency. I rarely touched the money, preferring to save it for future stability rather than immediate comfort. My relationship with them remained complicated. Weekly family therapy sessions helped us navigate the new boundaries, but trust rebuilt slowly, if at all. Some days were easier than others. Some wounds healed cleaner than others. Grandfather Lawrence had been true to his word as well. Within days of Thanksgiving, he had established a new trust, directly paying off my student loans and providing a modest stipend for my final semester, so I could focus on academics instead of working multiple jobs. He had offered me a position in his company after graduation, but I declined. I need to build something for myself, I explained. Without the Harrington name opening doors, he understood, even respected the decision. Instead, I accepted an entry-level position at a small financial advisory firm specializing in helping first-generation college graduates manage student debt and build wealth from scratch. The salary was modest compared to what I could have earned at grandfather's company, but the work felt meaningful, aligned with my values in a way I hadn't anticipated. My cousin Thomas surprised everyone by becoming one of my strongest supporters. After witnessing the Thanksgiving confrontation, he began questioning the values that had shaped his upbringing. We spoke regularly, and I tried to help him develop a healthier relationship with money than what our family had modeled. "I don't want to end up like Uncle Michael," he told me once. "Working just to maintain appearances, never satisfied no matter how much I have." Grandmother Eleanor and I grew closer than ever. Our early morning conversations had become a tradition whenever I visited, her wisdom helping me process my experiences and decide what kind of adult I wanted to become. "Money is just a tool, Addison," she reminded me often. "It can build or destroy. The choice is always yours." Perhaps the most unexpected development was a small scholarship fund I established with part of my trust. Working with my firm, I created a program for students working multiple jobs to afford college, providing not just financial assistance, but mentoring on financial literacy, breaking the cycles of debt and financial insecurity that had nearly consumed my own future. The first recipient was a young woman working 3 jobs while studying accounting, reminding me painfully of my own experience. When I called to tell her she'd been selected, her tears of relief were both heartbreaking and healing. The greatest lesson from my ordeal wasn't about money at all, but about authenticity. My parents had sacrificed their integrity on the altar of appearances, choosing to seem successful rather than live within their means. That choice had cascaded into betrayal, justified by entitlement and resentment. I was determined to live differently, to align my external circumstances with my internal values, to find contentment in enough rather than constantly reaching for more, to value relationships over possessions. The truth is, the deepest wounds often come from those closest to us, from the people who should protect rather than exploit. My parents' betrayal cut so deeply precisely because they were the ones who should have put my welfare above their desires. Yet even from this painful experience came growth. I learned that while we cannot control how others treat us, we can control our response. We can choose whether to let betrayal embitter us or strengthen us. We can decide which patterns to continue and which to break. When people ask if I've forgiven my parents, I still don't have a simple answer. Forgiveness is a process, not an event. Some days I feel compassion for the insecurities that drove their choices. Other days, the anger feels fresh as ever. What I do know is that I'm building a life of integrity for myself. A life where financial decisions reflect my values rather than insecurities, where relationships are based on honesty rather than appearances, where success is measured by impact rather than acquisition. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones measured in dollars. Sometimes they're the hard lessons that shape our character, the painful experiences that clarify our values, the broken trust that teaches us how to build something stronger. If you're facing betrayal or difficult family dynamics around money, remember that you get to write the next chapter. You get to decide which patterns to continue and which to break. The actions of others may shape your story, but they don't have to define your ending. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for a stronger future. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, your worth isn't determined by your net worth, but by the integrity with which you live.